The champagne bubbles caught the candlelight as my grandfather raised his glass and smiled across the table. "So Natalie," he said, his voice warm with what I thought was pride, "how have you been managing your $4,200,000 trust fund?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I blinked once, twice, my fork suspended halfway to my mouth. "What trust fund?" The conversation around the table died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My name is Natalie Chun, and until that moment on my 29th birthday, I believed I understood exactly where I stood in the world. I thought I knew my family. I thought I knew my worth. I thought the struggles I had endured for nearly a decade were simply the natural consequences of choosing an unconventional path and working my way up from nothing. I was wrong about all of it. The restaurant my parents had chosen for my birthday dinner was the kind of place where they bring the menu without prices, and the waitstaff moves like dancers through a choreographed performance. Preston's occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, all floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Puget Sound at sunset and interior design that whispered old money rather than shouting new wealth. My mother, Catherine Chun, sat to my right in a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her pearl necklace catching the light each time she moved. My father, David Chun, looked comfortable in his tailored charcoal suit, the same understated elegance he brought to his position as a senior partner at a prominent law firm. They had been discussing their recent trip to the Amalfi Coast when my grandfather arrived. Robert Zhang, my maternal grandfather, was a man whose very presence commanded attention without effort. At 78, he remained sharp-eyed and straight-backed, his silver hair impeccably styled, his navy suit precisely fitted. He had built a commercial real estate empire over 5 decades, transforming a single property investment into a portfolio that stretched across 3 states. I had always admired him from a respectful distance, seeing him perhaps 3 or 4 times a year at major holidays and occasional family dinners. He was kind to me in those interactions but maintained the emotional reserve common among men of his generation and cultural background. His unexpected appearance at my birthday dinner had surprised everyone at the table. My mother had risen with poorly concealed anxiety when he arrived. "Father, we weren't expecting you," she said, her voice climbing half an octave higher than normal. "I told you last week I would be attending," he replied calmly, embracing her before turning to shake my father's hand and then approaching me. His hug was brief but solid, and when he pulled back to look at me, something in his expression seemed almost sad. "Happy birthday, Natalie," he said. 29 years old. Time moves faster than we imagine. We had settled into superficial conversation, the kind that fills space without conveying information. My parents updated him on various family matters while I sat quietly, as I had learned to do at these gatherings, contributing when directly addressed but otherwise remaining a pleasant, smiling presence at the edge of the conversation. This had been my role in the family for as long as I could remember. The good daughter who did not make waves, who accepted what was offered without complaint, who understood that some topics were not open for discussion and some questions were impolite to ask. Then came the question about the trust fund, and everything I thought I knew began to disintegrate. My mother's hand, which had been reaching for her wine glass, froze in midair. My father's jaw tightened in that particular way that meant he was exerting significant effort to maintain his composure. The waiter who had been approaching our table seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and smoothly redirected toward a different section of the restaurant. The silence stretched and distorted until my grandfather spoke again, his tone unchanged, as though he had asked about the weather rather than detonating my entire understanding of my life. "The trust fund I established when you were born," he continued, looking directly at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Your parents were designated as trustees until you turned 25. At that point, full control was supposed to transfer to you." He paused, taking a measured sip of the whiskey the waiter had placed before him moments earlier. "That was 4 years ago." I found my voice, though it emerged smaller than I intended. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no trust fund. There's never been a trust fund." Even as I spoke the words, I felt a strange vertigo, as though the floor beneath my chair had suddenly become unstable. Fragments of memory began surfacing unbidden, Moments I had never questioned before but which now seemed to pulse with new and terrible significance. My mother laughed, the sound brittle and unconvincing. "Dad, I think you might be confused. We should discuss this privately, not here, not now." Her eyes darted toward me and then away, unable to hold contact. My father said nothing, but a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the restaurant's perfectly calibrated climate control. His hands, normally steady and confident, rested flat on the table as though he needed to anchor himself to something solid. My grandfather's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a hardening around the eyes that I had never witnessed before. When he spoke, his voice remained quiet but carried an edge that made my spine straighten involuntarily. "Catherine. David. I am not confused." He turned slightly in his chair and made a small gesture toward a woman who had been seated at the bar, far enough away that I had not noticed her arrival. She stood immediately and approached our table with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to professional environments. She carried a slim leather portfolio and wore a navy pantsuit that marked her as someone who meant business. "This is Jennifer Park, my attorney," my grandfather said as she reached our table. "Jennifer, please explain to my granddaughter the trust that was created in her name." My parents had gone very still, the kind of stillness that animals adopt when hoping to escape notice by predators. Jennifer Park opened her portfolio and removed several documents, placing them on the table between the dinner plates and untouched food with the careful precision of someone laying out evidence at a trial. "Miss Chun," she began, her voice clear and professional, "on the date of your birth, your grandfather established an irrevocable trust in your name with an initial deposit of $1 million. The trust was structured to grow through conservative investments over the course of your childhood and young adulthood. Your parents were named as trustees with the legal obligation to manage these funds in your best interest until you reached the age of 25, at which point complete control was to transfer to you." She slid one document toward me, a legal form dense with text and official stamps. My eyes could not focus on the words. They seemed to swim and blur as Jennifer Park continued speaking. "Based on the investment performance and the structure of the trust, the current value should be approximately $4,200,000. She paused, and in that pause, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates grinding against each other deep beneath the surface. As of this morning, when we conducted a preliminary inquiry, the actual balance in the trust account is $375,000. The number landed like a physical blow. $375,000. Nearly $4 million missing. Gone. I looked at my mother, whose face had drained of color beneath her expertly applied makeup. I looked at my father, whose hands had curled into fists on the white tablecloth. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them met my eyes. The silence that followed Jennifer Park's statement seemed to expand until it filled not just our table but the entire restaurant, pressing against my eardrums and making it difficult to breathe. Where did it go? My voice surprised me with its steadiness despite the chaos churning inside. If there was $4 million and now there's only $375,000, where did almost $4 million go? I directed the question to my parents, but they remained frozen, statues of themselves, as though hoping this moment might somehow pass if they simply refused to acknowledge it. My grandfather spoke instead. "That is precisely what we are here to determine." He looked at Jennifer Park and nodded once. She produced another set of documents, these bearing what appeared to be bank statements and transaction records. "We have requested a full forensic audit, which will take several weeks to complete. However, preliminary review of the account activity reveals a pattern of substantial withdrawals beginning approximately 7 years ago and continuing until 18 months ago." 7 years ago. I had been 22, just finishing my undergraduate degree at the University of Washington, and preparing to begin a master's program in social work. I had applied for student loans because my parents told me they could not help with graduate school costs, that I needed to learn financial responsibility and stand on my own feet. I had believed them. I had taken on $48,000 in student loan debt and worked 20 hours a week throughout my graduate program because I believed I had no other option. The memories came faster now, a cascade of moments reframed by this new and horrible knowledge. My 25th birthday, when I had received a card from my parents with a gift card to a moderately priced restaurant and a note wishing me well. No mention of a trust fund. No transfer of control. No acknowledgement that anything significant should have occurred on that date beyond marking another year of existence. I remembered feeling slightly disappointed that they had not suggested getting together for dinner, but telling myself that I was an adult now and should not expect my parents to make a fuss over birthdays. 3 years ago, when I had been laid off from my position at a nonprofit organization and had called my mother in tears, terrified about how I would make rent, she had suggested I look into budgeting apps and perhaps consider finding a roommate to reduce expenses. Everyone struggles sometimes, Natalie, she had told me. This is just part of growing up and learning to manage on your own. I had found a roommate, a woman named Sarah whom I had met through a mutual friend. Sarah became one of my closest friends, but I had found her out of desperation, not choice, because I was 3 days away from being unable to pay my rent and my mother had offered advice instead of assistance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 years ago, when my apartment building had been sold, and all the tenants received notice that our rent would increase by 40% when our lease is renewed, I had spent weeks searching for affordable housing, eventually finding a studio apartment in a marginal neighborhood, where car break-ins were common, and the building's heating system functioned sporadically. The apartment was 700 square feet of water-stained ceiling tiles and warped flooring, but it was what I could afford on my nonprofit salary, and I had told myself I was fortunate to have found anything at all in Seattle's brutal housing market. Every financial crisis, every moment of panic when unexpected expenses arose, every decision to skip social events because I could not afford the entry fee, or the meal or the transportation, every instance of friends talking about vacations or home purchases or retirement savings while I smiled and nodded, and felt the familiar weight of anxiety about my own precarious financial situation. All of that struggle, all of that fear, while my parents had access to millions of dollars that legally belonged to me. I would like to request that we continue this conversation in private, my grandfather said, standing from the table with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having his requests treated as directives. The restaurant manager appeared almost immediately, and within minutes we had been escorted to a private dining room at the back of the establishment, away from the main seating area and the curious glances of other diners who had surely noticed the tension at our table. The private room was smaller, and somehow more oppressive despite its elegant appointments. Dark wood paneling, subtle lighting. A table that could have seated 12 but now held only the 5 of us. Jennifer Park laid out additional documents while my grandfather took his seat at the head of the table. My parents sat across from me, still silent, still avoiding eye contact. I felt strangely detached from my own body, as though I were watching this scene unfold from a great distance rather than living it myself. The preliminary records show several categories of expenditure, Jennifer Park said, her finger tracing down a column of numbers on a spreadsheet. A property purchase in Bellevue for $1.8 million, registered under David and Catherine Chan. A series of vehicle purchases totaling $420,000. Extensive home renovations recorded at $650,000. Investment transfers to Catherine Chen's interior design business totaling $900,000. Various luxury expenditures including jewelry, travel, and country club memberships approaching $350,000. Each item felt like another stone added to a weight already crushing my chest. I listened to the litany of my parents' purchases, funded by money that had been meant for me, and something strange happened to my perception of the people sitting across the table. They began to look like strangers wearing my parents' faces, people I had never actually known despite spending 29 years in their presence. My mother finally spoke, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "We were going to tell you. We always planned to tell you." The statement was so absurd, so transparently false that I almost laughed. Instead, I heard myself ask a question with eerie calm. When? When were you planning to tell me? After you had spent every last dollar? After I had struggled for another decade thinking I had no resources and no support? My father found his voice, though it lacked his usual courtroom confidence. "We made some poor investment decisions. We thought we could replace the money before you needed it. We thought we had more time." The passive construction of his sentences struck me with sudden clarity. He was a litigator, trained in the art of language and persuasion, and even now, confronted with irrefutable evidence of theft from his own daughter, he could not bring himself to use active voice and claim direct responsibility. "You thought you had more time," I repeated slowly, testing the words. "More time before I discovered that you had been stealing from me for 7 years. More time to hide what you had done. More time to spend money that never belonged to you." My voice was rising now despite my efforts to control it. Years of suppressed frustration and swallowed hurt finally breaking through the surface. "I called you crying because I couldn't make rent, and you had access to $4 million of my money. Do you understand how profoundly wrong that is?" My mother began crying, tears tracking through her makeup, but even through my anger I recognized the performance quality of her distress. These were tears designed to elicit sympathy, to reframe the situation so that she became the victim deserving of comfort, rather than the perpetrator deserving of consequences. "We love you, Natalie," she said between sobs. "We have always loved you. We made terrible mistakes, but please understand that we never meant to hurt you." My grandfather's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Intent is irrelevant when discussing theft and breach of fiduciary duty. You were entrusted with your daughter's future, and you chose to prioritize your own desires." He turned to me, and his expression softened slightly. "Natalie, the decision about how to proceed is ultimately yours. Jennifer can explain your legal options. But you should know that they purchased airline tickets to Costa Rica 3 days ago. One-way tickets, departing next week." The information took several seconds to fully register. They had been planning to leave. They had been planning to run away, to disappear to a country with limited extradition agreements, to escape accountability for what they had done. They had come to this birthday dinner knowing it might be the last time they saw me. They had smiled and ordered expensive wine and asked polite questions about my work, all while preparing to vanish. I looked at my parents with new eyes, seeing them perhaps for the first time as they actually were rather than as I had needed them to be. My mother, whose interior design business had always seemed to consume far more money than it generated, whose wardrobe and jewelry and luxury car had never quite aligned with what I understood about their household income. My father, whose careful navigation of financial conversations now appeared less like discretion and more like active concealment. The 5-bedroom house they had purchased in Bellevue when I was in graduate school, which they had described as a fortunate opportunity made possible through careful saving and a favorable mortgage rate. The house that, according to Jennifer Park's documents, had actually been purchased with $1.8 million from my trust fund. "I need to leave," I said abruptly, pushing back from the table. My legs felt unsteady as I stood, but I managed to remain upright through sheer force of will. "I cannot be in this room with them right now." My grandfather stood as well, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "Jennifer and I will handle the immediate matters. Take the time you need. We will speak tomorrow and discuss next steps." He withdrew a business card from his jacket pocket and pressed it into my hand. "My personal cell phone number is on the back. Call me at any hour if you need anything." I walked out of the private dining room, through the main restaurant where beautiful people ate beautiful food and laughed at things that were probably not actually funny, and into the elevator that would carry me down to street level. The doors closed, and I was alone with my reflection in the polished metal surface. The woman looking back at me wore a dress I had borrowed from Sarah because I owned nothing appropriate for a high-end restaurant. She looked tired and thin and deeply uncertain. She looked like someone whose reality had just been torn apart and reassembled into a configuration that made no sense. The elevator reached the ground floor, and I stepped out into the Seattle evening. The air was cool and carried the salt smell of the Sound. People moved past me on the sidewalk, intent on their own destinations, unaware that anything extraordinary had occurred. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Sarah, who answered on the second ring. "How's the birthday dinner?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine interest. "Can you come pick me up?" I said, and something in my tone must have communicated the urgency because she did not ask questions, just asked for my location and said she would be there in 15 minutes. I stood on the sidewalk outside one of Seattle's most expensive restaurants and watched the traffic flow past. Somewhere above me, in that private dining room, my parents were being confronted with the consequences of 7 years of theft. Somewhere in my grandfather's attorney's briefcase were documents proving that my entire adult life had been constructed on a foundation of lies and stolen resources. Somewhere in my studio apartment with its water-stained ceiling and broken heating was the existence I had built believing I had no other options, no safety net, no resources beyond what I could earn through my own labor. Sarah's car pulled up to the curb, and I got in without speaking. She took one look at my face and pulled back into traffic, heading toward my apartment without needing directions. "What happened?" she asked gently. I opened my mouth to answer and found I did not know where to begin. How do you summarize the moment when you discover that everything you believed about your family, your circumstances, and your worth was fiction? How do you explain that you had been struggling to survive while your parents stole millions of dollars that belonged to you and planned their escape to another country? "My parents have been stealing from me for 7 years, I finally said, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them. "There was a trust fund for $1 million. They took almost all of it. And they were planning to leave the country next week." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles going white. She said nothing for several long moments, navigating through traffic while processing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Okay, what do you need right now? What can I do?" I realized I had no answer to that question. What did I need? Justice? Restitution? Revenge? Understanding? None of those words felt adequate to the situation. What I needed was to go back in time and prevent this from ever happening, to grow up in a family that protected rather than exploited me, to have parents who saw me as a person deserving of care rather than as a resource to be extracted and consumed. But that was impossible, and so I settled for something more immediate and achievable. "I need to go home and I need you to stay with me tonight because I do not want to be alone." Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand briefly before returning hers to the wheel. "Of course. Whatever you need. I'm here." The simple statement of solidarity broke something loose inside me, and I began to cry. Not the pretty, delicate tears my mother had produced in the restaurant, but ugly, wrenching sobs that seemed to originate somewhere deep in my core. I cried for the 22-year-old who had taken on student loans she should never have needed. I cried for the 25-year-old who had spent her birthday alone, unaware that her entire life should have changed that day. I cried for every version of myself who had struggled and suffered and blamed herself for not being strong enough or smart enough, or capable enough to build stability and security. Sarah drove through the darkening streets while I fell apart in her passenger seat, and for perhaps the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of betrayal without trying to minimize it or explain it away or find some way to excuse the inexcusable. My parents had stolen my future and called it love. They had watched me struggle and offered platitudes instead of resources that were legally mine. They had planned to abandon me to the consequences of their theft, while they escaped to a new life in another country. These were facts, documented and irrefutable, and no amount of tears or apologies could change them. We reached my apartment building, and Sarah helped me up the stairs to my studio. Inside, the space seemed somehow smaller than usual, the water stains on the ceiling more pronounced, the worn carpet more threadbare. This was the life I had built believing it was all I could afford. This was the reality I had accepted as the natural consequence of my choices and circumstances. But it had all been built on lies, and now I stood in the middle of my cramped apartment and saw it for what it truly was. Evidence of theft, tangible proof that my parents had prioritized their comfort over my survival. Sarah made tea while I sat on my second-hand couch and stared at the wall. She did not try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or premature advice. She simply sat beside me, a warm and solid presence, while I began the long process of accepting that my life as I had understood it was over and something new, still undefined and terrifying, was beginning. The morning after my birthday dinner arrived with cruel indifference to the fact that my entire world had shifted on its axis. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of my studio apartment, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air and casting harsh light on the reality I had woken into. Sarah had stayed the night, sleeping on my couch while I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and watching the water stains morph into shapes that seemed to mock me with their permanence. Those stains had been there when I moved in 2 years ago, and they would likely remain long after I left, unchanged witnesses to the small, constrained life I had built in this space. I had not always lived like this. The contrast between my current circumstances and my childhood was something I had spent years trying to reconcile, convincing myself that the gap between then and now represented normal progression into adult independence rather than anything more troubling. But now, armed with new information about my parents' systematic theft, I found myself revisiting those earlier years with a different lens, seeing patterns I had previously dismissed or excused. My childhood in Bellevue had been comfortable in the way that children rarely think to question. We lived in a decent house in a safe neighborhood, not extravagant but solid and pleasant. My parents both worked professional jobs, my mother as an interior designer with a small client base, and my father as an attorney climbing the partnership ladder at his firm. There was always food on the table, always new school supplies at the beginning of each year, always a modest birthday celebration and a reasonable Christmas. We were not wealthy in any ostentatious way, but we were secure, or so it seemed. What I remembered most from those years was the silence around money. It was never discussed in concrete terms, never explained or made transparent. When I asked questions about costs or finances, I received vague answers or gentle redirection to other topics. My parents spoke in euphemisms and generalities, creating an atmosphere where financial curiosity felt somehow rude or inappropriate. I learned early that good daughters did not press for information that was clearly not being offered, that there were boundaries around certain subjects that should not be crossed. When I was 12, my maternal grandmother passed away, and I remembered the hushed conversations between my mother and grandfather that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. There had been some kind of disagreement about the estate, raised voices behind closed doors, tension that lingered for months afterward. I had not understood it at the time, had assumed it was normal family conflict around inheritance and possessions. Now I wondered what had actually been discussed, whether my grandfather had attempted even then to establish protections for me that my mother had resisted. High school had been academically successful but socially isolating in ways I had attributed to my own personality rather than external factors. While my classmates went on shopping trips and attended concerts and took weekend trips to Vancouver, I remained largely on the periphery, not quite included in the casual social currency of adolescence. My parents provided what was necessary but rarely what was extra, and I learned not to ask for things that fell into the category of frivolous or unnecessary. I told myself I was naturally introverted, that I preferred staying home with books to going out with peers, but looking back I could see how much of that preference had been shaped by awareness that I could not fully participate in the social expectations of my environment. The conversations about college had been the first time money became explicitly discussed, though still in oblique and frustrating ways. I had been accepted to several universities, including some prestigious private institutions that had offered partial scholarships but still required substantial family contribution. My parents had sat me down at the kitchen table during my senior year of high school and explained with serious expressions that they wanted me to make a practical choice, that education was important but so was financial responsibility, that I should consider carefully the burden of student loans and choose accordingly. I had selected the University of Washington, a solid public institution with reasonable tuition for state residents. I had commuted from home to save on housing costs, spending hours each week on buses and light rail to attend classes and work at the part-time job I had secured at the university library. My parents had contributed what they described as everything they could afford toward tuition, leaving me to cover the gap with loans and work-study income. I had been grateful for their help, had felt fortunate to have any parental contribution at all when so many of my peers received nothing. During my undergraduate years, I had watched my mother's interior design business expand in ways that seemed to require constant capital infusion. There was always some new expense, some essential investment in marketing or inventory or professional development. My father's career had progressed steadily, his name appearing on the firm letterhead, his responsibilities and presumably his income growing. Yet when I tentatively raised the possibility of them helping more with my college costs, the answer had been a firm but gentle no, accompanied by lectures about the importance of taking ownership of my education and learning the value of money through personal sacrifice. The summer after I completed my undergraduate degree, I had been working 2 jobs while preparing applications for graduate programs in social work. Social work had called to me since my teenage years, drawn by a desire to help people navigate systems and access resources they needed. The irony of that career choice, given my current situation, was not lost on me as I lay in my studio apartment reassessing my entire life narrative. I had wanted to help others advocate for themselves and secure their rights, all while being utterly blind to how my own rights were being systematically violated by the people who should have protected them. Graduate school had meant more loans, more work, more careful budgeting of every dollar. I remembered sitting in my childhood bedroom, now feeling too small and childish for a 22-year-old adult, and running the numbers over and over, trying to find some way to make the costs work without drowning in debt. My parents had been sympathetic but clear that they could not contribute to graduate education. My mother had actually said the words that now echoed with bitter irony in my memory. "We have to think about our own retirement, sweetheart. We cannot sacrifice our future security to fund your education indefinitely." Their future security. The phrase lodged in my throat like a physical obstruction. They had been sitting on a trust fund containing over $4 million designated specifically for my future, and they had looked me in the eye and told me they needed to protect their retirement savings. The audacity of that lie, the calculated cruelty of it, felt almost breathtaking in its scope. I had taken out $48,000 in additional student loans for graduate school, and had moved into a shared house with 3 other students to minimize expenses. The house had been in the university district, an aging structure with thin walls and temperamental plumbing, divided into bedrooms that were barely large enough for a bed and a desk. My room had been on the north side, dark and cold even in summer, with a window that overlooked a parking lot where car alarms seemed to activate with disturbing frequency. My roommates during those years had been kind people also struggling through graduate programs in various fields. We had created a makeshift family of sorts, sharing meals cobbled together from whatever ingredients were on sale, celebrating small victories and commiserating over setbacks. I had been close with them in the way that people become close through shared hardship, but those relationships had naturally faded after graduation as we dispersed to different jobs and cities. At the time, I had accepted this as normal life progression. Now I wondered how different those years might have been if I had possessed the resources that were legally mine, if I had been able to focus fully on my studies rather than working 20 hours per week to cover basic living expenses. The graduate program itself had been challenging in ways that went beyond the academic material. Social work education required confronting difficult realities about poverty, trauma, systemic injustice, and the inadequacy of existing support structures. We learned about how people fell through cracks in the safety net, about how systems designed to help often created additional barriers, about how those without resources or advocates faced obstacles that seemed almost deliberately designed to prevent their success. I had absorbed these lessons and felt righteous anger on behalf of the clients I would someday serve, never imagining that I was myself a victim of exactly the kind of exploitation and abuse of power we studied in our courses. During my second year of graduate school, my parents had moved from our childhood home in Bellevue to a significantly larger house in a more prestigious neighborhood. They had invited me to a housewarming party, and I had walked through rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly, taking in the gleaming hardwood floors and marble countertops and bathrooms that were larger than my entire bedroom in the shared house. My mother had given me a tour with obvious pride, explaining the renovations they had done and her vision for the interior design of each space. I had asked, trying to keep my tone light and curious rather than accusatory, how they had managed to afford such a substantial upgrade. My father had explained something about favorable market timing and a good mortgage rate, and his recent promotion to senior partner allowing them to qualify for better financing terms. The explanation had seemed plausible enough, and I had pushed down the small voice that wondered why they could afford this luxury while I was living in a dark, cold bedroom and eating rice and beans for dinner most nights. The housewarming party had been filled with their friends and colleagues, successful people in expensive clothing who sipped wine and complimented my parents' excellent taste. I had felt acutely out of place in my thrift store dress and discount shoes, aware that I looked like exactly what I was, a struggling graduate student who could not afford to belong in spaces like this. My mother had introduced me to various guests with phrases like "our daughter," the future social worker, that somehow managed to sound both proud and faintly disappointed, as though my chosen career path was admirable in its altruism but regrettable in its lack of financial prospects. One of my mother's friends, a woman in her 50s wearing jewelry that probably cost more than my annual stipend, had cornered me near the catering table and asked with the kind of intrusive directness that wealthy people seem to consider acceptable whether my parents were helping me financially with school. I had felt my face flush with embarrassment as I explained that I was managing through loans and work study, that I wanted to be independent and take responsibility for my own education. The woman had made a sympathetic noise and said something about how important it was to learn self-sufficiency, all while holding a glass of wine that likely cost more than my weekly grocery budget. After graduation, I had secured a position at a nonprofit organization focused on housing advocacy and services for people experiencing homelessness. The work had been meaningful but exhausting, the kind of position where you gave everything you had and watched it still not be enough because the problems were so vast and the resources so limited. My starting salary had been $38,000 per year, barely enough to cover rent, loan payments, and basic expenses in Seattle's increasingly expensive housing market. I had congratulated myself on finding any position at all in my field, and tried not to calculate how many years it would take to pay off my student loans on that salary. My parents had taken me to dinner to celebrate the job offer. Another upscale restaurant where the menu prices made my stomach clench with anxiety. They had been genuinely pleased about my employment, praising my dedication to helping others and my willingness to work in a difficult field. My father had offered career advice about the importance of networking and continuing education. My mother had suggested I start thinking about retirement savings even on my modest salary, the power of compound interest meaning that even small contributions now would grow significantly over time. Neither of them had offered any financial assistance or acknowledged that my salary barely covered survival, let alone allowed for retirement contributions. The first few years of professional life had been a constant exercise in financial tightrope walking. Every unexpected expense became a crisis requiring careful calculation and often painful choices. When my car needed major repairs, I had spent weeks researching whether it was more financially sound to fix it or replace it with another used vehicle, eventually deciding to go without a car entirely and rely on public transportation despite the additional time burden. When I needed dental work that my minimal insurance did not fully cover, I had delayed the treatment for months while saving up the out-of-pocket costs, living with increasing pain because I could not afford to address it immediately. My social life had contracted to match my financial reality. I had attended fewer events with friends, made excuses about being busy rather than admitting I could not afford the restaurant or the concert or the weekend trip. Some friendships had naturally faded under these constraints, and I had told myself this was normal life progression rather than the result of economic barriers. The friends who remained were generally people in similar circumstances, others working in nonprofit or public service sectors where dedication to mission compensated for low compensation. Sarah had been one of those friends, someone I met through a mutual connection about 3 years ago. She worked as a public school teacher, another profession that required extensive education and resulted in modest compensation. We had bonded over shared experiences of loving our work while struggling to make ends meet, a feeling called to service while living paycheck to paycheck. When my apartment building had been sold and the rent increased beyond what I could manage, Sarah had been the one who helped me search for something affordable, the one who had accompanied me to view the studio apartment I now occupied and helped me see its potential rather than just its obvious flaws. The studio had been the best option available in my price range, 700 square feet in a neighborhood that real estate listings optimistically described as emerging, but which really meant it had not yet gentrified to the point of pricing out working-class residents. The building was old, its systems unreliable, its maintenance minimal. The heating worked intermittently, the hot water had unpredictable availability, and the insulation was so poor that I could hear my neighbors' conversations through the walls. But it was mine, or at least I was legally entitled to occupy it in exchange for monthly rent that consumed nearly half my income. I had made the space as comfortable as possible with second-hand furniture and creative solutions to its various shortcomings. The water stains on the ceiling were covered with fabric I had stretched and stapled, creating a makeshift canopy effect. The inadequate heating was supplemented with space heaters that drove up my electricity bill, but kept the apartment tolerably warm during Seattle's damp winters. The lack of storage was addressed with furniture that doubled as organization, beds with drawers underneath and tables with shelves built in. I had been proud of my ability to make the space work, to create a home despite its limitations. Now, standing in that same studio apartment with Sarah asleep on the couch and morning light exposing every flaw and makeshift solution, I saw it differently. This was not evidence of my resourcefulness or resilience. This was evidence of theft. This cramped, cold, poorly maintained space represented what my life looked like when nearly $4 million that belonged to me was stolen, and spent by my parents on their comfort and luxury. The Bellevue house with its 5 bedrooms and marble countertops, purchased with $1.8 million from my trust fund. The luxury vehicles, one for each parent, totaling over $400,000. The renovations and furnishings my mother had selected with such care, costing $650,000. Her interior design business, propped up with $900,000 in investments that apparently came from my stolen resources rather than any legitimate business success. The jewelry, the travel, the country club membership, all purchased with money designated for my future while I lived in spaces like this and worried about how to afford dental work. Sarah stirred on the couch, and I moved to the small kitchen area to make coffee, needing something to do with my hands while my mind continued processing the implications of everything I had learned. The coffee maker was a cheap model from a discount store, the kind that required precise measurement and careful timing to produce anything drinkable. I had become expert at coaxing acceptable coffee from inadequate equipment, another small skill developed through financial constraint. As the coffee brewed, I thought about all the times I had defended my parents to friends who gently questioned their lack of support. When Sarah had expressed surprise that they had not helped more with my graduate school costs, I had explained their need to protect their retirement savings. When my coworker Marcus had mentioned that his parents helped him with a down payment on a condo, I had said my parents believed in the importance of financial independence. When my friend Jessica's parents had paid off her student loans as a graduation gift, I had insisted that everyone's situation was different and my parents showed their love in other ways. What other ways? The question surfaced now with uncomfortable insistence. In what ways had my parents actually shown love beyond the basic requirements of housing and feeding a child until adulthood? They had not been abusive in any obvious sense. There had been no physical violence, no overt emotional cruelty, nothing that would have triggered concern from teachers or social workers or other mandated reporters. But there had also been a fundamental absence of generosity, a withholding that I had internalized as normal rather than recognizing as deliberate. I thought about the birthday and Christmas gifts over the years, always modest and practical. Books and clothing, kitchen items and office supplies, things I needed anyway and would have purchased for myself. Never anything extravagant or purely for pleasure. Never anything that suggested they had considered what I might want rather than what I needed. I had told myself this was because they valued practicality over materialism, that they were teaching me not to measure love in terms of expensive presents. But my mother wore jewelry that cost thousands of dollars. My father drove a luxury sedan. Their house contained furniture and art that represented enormous expenditure. They clearly believed in expensive presents for themselves, justified by my stolen money. The practicality they had preached to me was apparently a value they held only for their daughter, not for their own lives. The coffee finished brewing and I poured 2 cups, adding the small amount of milk I kept in my temperamental refrigerator. Sarah sat up on the couch, running her hands through her hair and looking at me with concern. I handed her the coffee and sat in the single armchair I owned, cradling my own cup and feeling its warmth against my palms. "Did you sleep at all?" Sarah asked gently. I shook my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about different moments from my life, and seeing them differently now. Everything looks different when you know the truth. Sarah sipped her coffee and waited, giving me space to continue if I wanted or remain silent if I preferred. This was one of the qualities I most valued in her friendship, the ability to be present without demanding anything, to offer support without imposing expectations. "I have been blaming myself for years," I said quietly, "for not being better with money, for not advancing faster in my career, for living like this." I gestured around the studio apartment. I thought there was something wrong with me, some failure of character or capability that explained why I struggled so much. But it was not me. It was them. They were stealing from me the entire time and watching me suffer. Sarah's expression hardened. "That is exactly what it was. Theft. And you need to remember that as you figure out what to do next. You did not fail. They stole from you." The clear, unequivocal statement felt like a lifeline. Sarah had no emotional investment in maintaining a relationship with my parents, no need to soften or excuse their actions. She could see the situation with clarity I was still struggling to achieve through the fog of shock and complicated family emotions. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen to see it was from my grandfather. The message was brief and formal in the way that people of his generation often communicated through text. Please call when you are available to discuss next steps. Jennifer and I are prepared to meet at your convenience. I showed the message to Sarah, who read it and nodded. You should probably call him soon. The longer you wait, the more time your parents have to hide assets or create additional complications. She was right, of course. I needed to engage with the practical realities of the situation despite feeling emotionally unprepared for any of it. I needed to understand my legal options, to learn what could be recovered and what was permanently lost, to make decisions about how to proceed. But the thought of those conversations filled me with exhaustion that seemed to go beyond lack of sleep, a bone-deep weariness at the prospect of navigating complex systems and making choices with enormous consequences while still processing the fundamental betrayal. I will call him after you leave, I said. I do not want to have that conversation while you are here. You have already given up your entire evening and morning for me. Sarah shook her head firmly. I am not going anywhere unless you want me to. I can call in sick to work. You should not have to deal with this alone. The offer made my throat tighten with gratitude and grief. This was what care looked like, what genuine support meant. Someone rearranging their life to be present during a crisis, offering help without conditions or resentment. The contrast with my parents' behavior could not have been more stark. We sat together in the studio apartment as morning progressed into afternoon, talking intermittently and sometimes just being silent together. Sarah ordered food from a nearby restaurant, insisting on paying despite my half-hearted protests. We ate pad thai from takeout containers while I began telling her stories from my childhood and young adulthood, moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time but which now appeared in a different light. The time when I was 16 and needed money for a school trip, and my parents had insisted I earn it through extra chores rather than simply giving it to me. The college graduation when they had given me a book on financial literacy rather than any monetary gift. The countless times I had asked for help and received advice instead, suggestions for budgeting and sacrifice while they lived in increasing luxury. Each memory felt like another piece of evidence in a case I was building against people I had loved unconditionally for 29 years. Eventually, Sarah did need to leave, having already used her available sick time earlier in the school year. She hugged me tightly before departing, made me promise to call if I needed anything, and left me alone in the apartment with my phone and the contact information for my grandfather and his attorney. I sat for several long minutes, gathering courage to make the call that would move this situation from abstract shock to concrete action. When I finally called, my grandfather answered on the second ring, his voice calm and steady in a way that provided unexpected comfort. We arranged to meet the following day at Jennifer Park's office, where they would explain my options and help me understand the full scope of what had been done and what could potentially be recovered. He asked how I was managing, and I found myself unable to articulate an answer beyond a simple acknowledgement that I was overwhelmed. He accepted this without pressing for elaboration, simply assuring me that they would provide whatever support I needed going forward. After ending the call, I walked to the window of my studio apartment and looked out at the neighborhood, at the street with its mixture of struggling businesses and empty storefronts, at the people moving along the sidewalk absorbed in their own concerns. Somewhere across the city, my parents were in the house purchased with my money, likely consulting their own attorneys about how to minimize consequences for what they had done. Somewhere in the legal system were mechanisms for pursuing justice and restitution, procedures that would need to be initiated and followed. Somewhere in my own psychology were coping mechanisms that would need to be developed to process this betrayal and rebuild a sense of identity not predicated on lies. I pressed my hand against the window, feeling the cold glass against my palm, and made a commitment to myself. I would not minimize this. I would not make excuses for them. I would not prioritize their comfort over my own healing. Whatever came next, whatever difficult decisions needed to be made, I would face them with the support of people who actually cared about my well-being, rather than people who had systematically exploited me while claiming to love me. The water stains on my ceiling remained unchanged, but I saw them now as temporary conditions rather than permanent features of my life. This apartment, this constrained existence, this financial struggle were all artificial constructs built on theft. The real story of my life, the one where I had resources and security that were rightfully mine, was about to begin. And though I could not yet see what that story would look like, I knew with absolute certainty that it would be different from everything that had come before. The morning of my meeting with my grandfather and Jennifer Park arrived with the weight of inevitability. I had spent the previous day in a strange suspended state, unable to focus on anything substantive yet unable to rest. The studio apartment felt simultaneously too small and too empty, the walls seeming to press inward, while the silence expanded to fill every corner. I had attempted to work on some freelance graphic design projects I had taken to supplement my nonprofit salary, but my concentration fractured after only minutes, my mind returning obsessively to the revelation at the birthday dinner, and the implication still unfolding like a toxic bloom. Sarah had texted multiple times throughout the previous day, checking on me and offering to come back over. I had declined, needing the solitude to begin processing what felt like an impossible amount of information and emotion. But the solitude had proven less therapeutic than oppressive, leaving me alone with thoughts that circled endlessly without resolution. By the time I went to bed, I had achieved nothing beyond wearing grooves deeper into the same mental paths, examining and re-examining memories through the lens of my parents' betrayal, until even the most innocent moments from my childhood seemed contaminated by hidden motives and calculated deception. I dressed carefully for the meeting, selecting clothing that struck a balance between professional and comfortable. The act of choosing what to wear felt absurdly trivial given the magnitude of what I was about to discuss, yet also strangely grounding, a small exercise of control in a situation where I felt fundamentally powerless. I settled on dark pants and a simple blouse, clothing that would allow me to be taken seriously without requiring me to perform confidence I did not feel. Jennifer Park's office was located downtown in one of the newer high-rises that had transformed Seattle's skyline over the past decade. The building was all glass and steel, its lobby featuring art installations and carefully curated plantings that spoke to wealth and taste. I felt acutely aware of my second-hand clothing and worn shoes as I crossed the marble floor toward the elevator bank, conscious of how much I did not belong in spaces like this despite having every right to occupy them. The law firm occupied the entire 23rd floor, and the elevator opened directly into a reception area that managed to be both welcoming and intimidating. Soft lighting, comfortable seating, and subtle music created an atmosphere of calm professionalism, while the furnishings and finishes communicated clearly that services here came with substantial price tags. A receptionist greeted me with a warm smile and asked me to wait while she notified Jennifer Park of my arrival. My grandfather appeared within minutes, emerging from a hallway beyond the reception area and approaching with the same measured dignity he had displayed at the restaurant. He embraced me briefly, and I caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtle that I associated with the few times in my life when we had been in close proximity. "Thank you for coming, Natalie," he said quietly. "I know this is extraordinarily difficult. We will do everything possible to support you through the process ahead." He guided me through the hallway to a conference room where Jennifer Park waited, seated at a large table with documents and folders arranged in neat stacks before her. She stood as we entered, shaking my hand with a firm grip that conveyed both professionalism and something that might have been sympathy. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Would you like coffee or tea before we begin?" I accepted coffee, needing something to do with my hands and hoping the caffeine might help cut through the fog that seemed to have settled over my thoughts. A paralegal appeared almost immediately with a tray containing coffee service and pastries that looked too beautiful to eat. I prepared my coffee with hands that trembled slightly, aware that both my grandfather and Jennifer Park were observing me with concern barely concealed beneath professional courtesy. Once we were all seated, Jennifer Park opened the folder directly in front of her and withdrew a document that appeared to be several pages long. "I want to begin by explaining what we have discovered through our preliminary investigation," she said, her tone measured and clear. "The full forensic audit will take several more weeks to complete, but we have enough information now to understand the basic parameters of what occurred and to discuss your options for moving forward." She slid a summary sheet across the table toward me, a single page dense with numbers and dates that seemed to swim before my eyes. I forced myself to focus, to read the information even as my brain resisted processing its implications. The trust had been established on the date of my birth with an initial deposit of $1 million, as she had mentioned at the restaurant. The investment strategy had been conservative but effective, And the account had grown steadily over the first 22 years of my life with no withdrawals of any kind. Then, 7 years ago, the pattern had changed dramatically. The first withdrawal had been for $150,000, categorized vaguely as family emergency expenses. 3 months later, another withdrawal of $200,000 for what was described as temporary loan to trustees. Over the following months and years, the withdrawals had accelerated in both frequency and amount, sometimes multiple transactions in a single month, the justifications becoming increasingly thin and nonsensical. Jennifer Park walked me through the timeline, her finger tracing down the column of transactions while she explained what each represented. The Bellevue house purchase had involved direct transfer of $1.8 million from the trust to escrow, with my parents listed as the buyers and my name appearing nowhere on the title or mortgage documents. The vehicles had been purchased through a series of smaller withdrawals that cumulatively totaled over $400,000. The renovation expenses had been paid through checks written directly from the trust account to various contractors and suppliers. The investment in my mother's interior design business had been structured slightly differently, transferred into a separate business account that my mother controlled entirely. Jennifer Park had obtained records showing that the business had generated minimal revenue despite these substantial capital infusions, suggesting that the money had effectively been converted into personal spending rather than any legitimate business development. The luxury expenditures had been the most brazen, including jewelry purchases exceeding $100,000, international travel costing tens of thousands per trip, and ongoing country club fees that consumed thousands monthly. The total withdrawals over the 7-year period amount to $3,873,000, Jennifer Park said, her voice steady despite the staggering figure. The remaining balance, as I mentioned at the restaurant, is currently $375,000. However, some of the withdrawn funds were used for investments and purchases that retain value. The house, for instance, has appreciated significantly and is now worth approximately $2.3 million. The vehicles have depreciated but still hold some value, probably around $150,000 combined. Some of the jewelry and other physical assets could be liquidated. I tried to speak but found my throat had closed. I swallowed hard and tried again. So not everything is gone. Some of it could be recovered. Jennifer Park nodded carefully. Yes, but recovery is not simple or guaranteed. It will require legal action, and your parents could contest every aspect of the process. They could claim various defenses, argue about valuation, attempt to hide or transfer assets. The litigation could take years and cost substantial amounts in legal fees. My grandfather spoke for the first time since we had sat down. I am prepared to cover all legal costs associated with pursuing full recovery and accountability. Money should not be a barrier to seeking justice in this situation. The offer was generous beyond measure, yet I found myself hesitating. The prospect of years of litigation, of ongoing confrontation and conflict with my parents, felt overwhelming in a way I struggled to articulate. Part of me wanted simply to walk away, to cut all ties and rebuild my life without the emotional burden of pursuing them through the courts. Jennifer Park seemed to read something in my expression because she leaned forward slightly and said, "I understand this feels impossible right now. You do not need to make any final decisions today. What I want to do this morning is ensure you understand the full scope of what happened and what your legal options are. Then you can take time to consider how you want to proceed." She withdrew another document from her folder, this one appearing to be some kind of official legal filing. Your parents were trustees of the account, which means they had a fiduciary duty to manage the funds solely in your best interest. Every withdrawal they made for their own benefit was a breach of that duty. Additionally, because they were in a position of trust and authority over you, their actions likely constitute financial exploitation and fraud. These are both civil matters which would allow you to sue for damages and recovery, and potentially criminal matters which would involve prosecution by the state. The word criminal landed with particular force. I had been thinking of this situation primarily in terms of betrayal and family dysfunction, but Jennifer Park was describing actual crimes with potential criminal consequences including incarceration. The idea of my parents facing criminal charges, potentially going to prison, created a complicated swirl of emotions I could not untangle. They had stolen from me systematically over 7 years, had watched me struggle and suffer while enriching themselves with my money, had planned to flee the country to escape accountability. By any objective measure, they deserved serious consequences. Yet they were still my parents, and some part of me recoiled from the idea of being responsible for their imprisonment. My grandfather must have seen the conflict on my face because he spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. Natalie, I want you to understand something important. Whatever consequences your parents face are the result of their own choices, not yours. They chose to steal from you. They chose to continue stealing even as they watched you struggle. They chose to plan an escape rather than making any attempt at restitution or apology. Your choice now is simply whether to allow those actions to have consequences, or to protect them from accountability. His framing shifted something in my perspective. I had been conceptualizing the decision as whether to punish my parents, casting myself in the role of aggressor or avenger. But he was right that they had already committed the harmful acts. The question was whether those acts would be addressed through legal systems designed for exactly this purpose, or whether they would be allowed to stand without consequence, implicitly condoning theft and exploitation. Jennifer Park continued her explanation of the legal landscape. In terms of civil action, we would file suit for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking full restitution of the stolen funds plus damages for the harm caused. We would request immediate injunctive relief to prevent them from selling, transferring, or encumbering any assets pending resolution of the case. We would also pursue forensic accounting to ensure we have captured every transaction and identified all assets that could be recovered. She paused to take a sip of her own coffee before continuing. The civil case would be entirely under your control. You would decide whether to settle or proceed to trial, what terms you would accept, and how aggressively to pursue full recovery. The criminal matter is different because it would be prosecuted by the state rather than by you personally. However, the prosecutor would consider your wishes and cooperation. If you wanted to pursue criminal charges, your testimony and cooperation would be essential. If you preferred not to pursue criminal charges, the prosecutor might still proceed but would face a more difficult case without your participation. I absorbed this information slowly, trying to imagine myself testifying in court about my parents' theft, sitting across from them in a courtroom while lawyers dissected our family history and financial records. The prospect made me feel physically ill, yet the alternative of simply accepting what they had done seemed equally intolerable. How could I move forward with my life knowing they had faced no meaningful consequences, that the message sent was that stealing millions of dollars from your own child was ultimately acceptable if you simply refused to acknowledge wrongdoing? There is another factor you should be aware of, Jennifer Park said, her expression darkening slightly. The airline tickets to Costa Rica that your grandfather mentioned. We have been monitoring your parents' financial activity since the revelation at the restaurant, and there have been several concerning transactions. They have withdrawn substantial cash from their bank accounts. They have made inquiries about selling the Bellevue house on an accelerated timeline, and they have begun transferring assets into accounts under different names, likely belonging to friends or relatives who they believe we cannot trace. The information hit me like a physical blow. Even now, even after being confronted with evidence of their theft, they were not considering how to make amends or face consequences with dignity. They were actively working to hide assets and prepare for flight. Whatever small hope I had been harboring that they might surprise me with genuine remorse and attempts at restitution evaporated in that moment. They were not sorry. They were only sorry they had been caught, and they were doing everything in their power to avoid accountability. My grandfather's expression had hardened as Jennifer Park delivered this update. This is why I urged you to meet with us quickly, he said. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to dissipate assets and complicate recovery. I do not want to pressure you into decisions you are not ready to make, but I need you to understand that time is not on our side in this situation. I felt the walls of the conference room pressing inward, the weight of decisions I felt unprepared to make settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. Part of me wanted to simply hand the entire situation to my grandfather and Jennifer Park, to tell them to do whatever they thought best and insulate myself from the difficult choices. But I knew that abdication was not truly an option, that these decisions would shape my life for years to come and needed to be made with my full participation and consent. What happens if they leave the country? I asked, my voice emerging smaller than I intended. If they actually get on that plane to Costa Rica, What does that mean for recovery? Jennifer Park and my grandfather exchanged a glance before she responded. It would complicate matters significantly. Costa Rica does not have an extradition treaty with the United States for most financial crimes. If they established residence there, recovering assets would become much more difficult and expensive. We could still pursue civil judgments and attempt to enforce them through international legal mechanisms, but the process would be lengthy and uncertain. Essentially, if they successfully flee, your likelihood of meaningful recovery drops substantially. The timeline suddenly felt brutally compressed. The tickets were for the following week, less than 7 days away. If I was going to take action to prevent their departure, to freeze their assets and force them to face consequences, I needed to make decisions immediately rather than taking the time I had assumed would be available for careful consideration and processing. They had stolen years from me through their theft, and now they were stealing even the opportunity for thoughtful response by creating artificial urgency through their attempted flight. I looked at my grandfather, this man who had created a substantial trust to provide for my future, who had discovered its misappropriation and immediately taken action despite the personal cost of confronting his own daughter's crimes, who sat before me now offering unlimited financial support for pursuing justice. His face showed both determination and sorrow, the conflict of wanting accountability, while losing his relationship with his daughter in the process. If he could face these impossible choices with courage, perhaps I could as well. I want to stop them from leaving, I said, the words emerging with more certainty than I felt. I want to freeze their assets so they cannot hide anything else. I want a full accounting of every dollar they took and where it went. Jennifer Park nodded, making notes on a legal pad. We can file for emergency injunctive relief this afternoon. The judge will likely grant a temporary restraining order preventing them from selling or transferring assets, and potentially from leaving the jurisdiction pending a full hearing. That hearing would typically occur within 10 to 14 days. She looked up from her notes, meeting my eyes directly. I need to be clear about what you are initiating. Once we file these motions, your parents will be formally notified. They will hire their own attorneys. This will become adversarial litigation that could extend for months or years. There will be depositions, document production, potentially a trial. Many aspects of your life and theirs will be examined in detail. It will be expensive for them, even with your grandfather covering your costs, and it will be emotionally draining for everyone involved. Are you prepared for that reality? I thought about the studio apartment with its water-stained ceiling, about the years of student loan payments stretching ahead of me, about every moment I had struggled and suffered while my parents lived in luxury funded by my stolen money. I thought about their planning to flee rather than face me, about the continuing asset transfers even now, about their complete absence of remorse or accountability. I thought about the person I might have become if I had possessed the resources that were rightfully mine, the opportunities one might have pursued, the security and freedom that should have been my inheritance. Yes, I said firmly. I am prepared. File whatever motions are necessary to stop them from leaving and hiding assets. I want full recovery of everything they took. My grandfather reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, his expression conveying both support and something that might have been pride. Jennifer Park continued making notes, the scratch of her pen on paper the only sound in the conference room for several long moments. There is one more issue we need to address, she said finally, looking up from her legal pad. Your current living situation and financial circumstances. You are still operating with minimal resources while this litigation proceeds, and that puts you in a vulnerable position. Your parents could potentially use your financial desperation against you, suggesting settlement terms that provide immediate, but inadequate recovery in exchange for dropping more comprehensive claims. We need to ensure you have enough financial stability to make decisions based on what is right rather than what is urgent. My grandfather spoke before I could respond. I have already arranged to establish a support account for Natalie's immediate needs. She will have access to funds sufficient for comfortable living while this matter proceeds. I started to protest, uncomfortable with accepting what felt like charity, but he raised a hand to forestall my objection. This is not charity. This is ensuring that my granddaughter has access to resources she should have possessed all along. Consider it in advance against what you will eventually recover. The offer was both generous and uncomfortable, highlighting how dependent I had become on others' financial decisions, and how little control I had possessed over my own material circumstances. Yet I recognized the wisdom of his suggestion. I could not effectively pursue justice against my parents while simultaneously worrying about rent and groceries, could not make sound legal decisions while operating from a position of desperate financial need. Accepting this support was not weakness but rather strategic necessity. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I will accept that help while the case proceeds." My grandfather nodded, satisfied, and Jennifer Park made another note on her legal pad. We spent the next hour discussing practical details, signing initial documents, and establishing the framework for the legal action that would commence that afternoon. Jennifer Park explained the timeline for various filings and hearings, the process for the forensic audit, and the likely sequence of events over the coming weeks and months. By the time I left her office, the morning had stretched into early afternoon. I felt simultaneously energized and exhausted, empowered by having taken concrete action yet overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had set in motion. My grandfather walked me to the elevator, and before I stepped inside, he pulled me into a more substantial embrace than his usual reserved gestures. "You are stronger than you know," he said quietly. "Your parents tried to keep you small and dependent, but they failed. You are going to come through this and build a life they never wanted you to have." His words settled into some deep place inside me, a foundation I could build upon when my own conviction wavered. The elevator descended toward the lobby, and I watched the floor numbers decrease while considering what came next. Jennifer Park would file the emergency motions within hours. My parents would be served with legal papers, confronted with formal allegations of their theft and exploitation. The restraining order would prevent them from leaving the country or transferring assets. The careful facade they had maintained for decades would be torn away, their actions made public record through court filings and proceedings. I emerged from the building into the Seattle afternoon, the city continuing its ordinary operations around me while my entire world realigned itself. I needed to call Sarah, to update her on what had transpired and perhaps to ask her to come over again, because I did not want to be alone while processing the choices I had just made. I needed to consider how to handle the inevitable contact from my parents once they received the legal papers. I needed to begin imagining what my life might look like with resources and security that had been stolen from me now potentially recovered. But first, I simply stood on the sidewalk outside Jennifer Park's building and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had done. I had chosen to pursue justice despite the personal cost, to demand accountability rather than protecting those who had harmed me, to prioritize my own healing and future over maintaining a false peace. The decision felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure, a step into unknown territory that could not be reversed or recalled. Whatever came next, whatever consequences flowed from this choice, I had claimed agency over my own story in a way I had never managed before. My parents had spent 29 years trying to control my narrative and constrain my possibilities, but that control ended today. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, who answered immediately with obvious concern in her voice. "How did it go?" she asked. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and began explaining what I had learned and what I had decided. As I spoke, I heard my own voice growing stronger and more certain, the initial trembling fading into something that sounded almost like confidence. I was not okay, not yet, but I was moving towards something better than I had been. I was finally, after 29 years, beginning to fight for myself. The legal papers were served to my parents 48 hours after my meeting with Jennifer Park, delivered by a professional process server to their Bellevue home on a Thursday morning. I knew the exact timing because Jennifer Park had called to confirm service had been completed, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction as she reported that both my mother and father had been present to receive the documents. The emergency motion for a temporary restraining order had been granted by a judge that same afternoon, freezing their assets and prohibiting them from leaving King County pending a full hearing scheduled for the following week. I had not been present for the service, had not witnessed their reactions as they opened the legal envelope and read the formal allegations of breach of fiduciary duty, financial exploitation, and fraud. Part of me wished I could have seen their faces in that moment, watched the reality of consequences penetrate whatever protective denial they had constructed around their actions. But a larger part of me was grateful for the distance, for the buffer of legal professionals and formal procedures that insulated me from direct confrontation, while the initial shock waves spread through the situation. The phone calls began within hours of service. My mother called first, her number appearing on my phone screen while I sat in my studio apartment trying to focus on work that seemed impossibly trivial compared to the magnitude of what was unfolding. I let the call go to voicemail, my hand hovering over the phone but unable to bring myself to answer. The voicemail she left was brief and strained, her voice tight with emotion that I could not identify as genuine distress or performed victimhood. "Natalie, we need to talk. Please call me back. There has been a terrible misunderstanding, and we need to fix this before it goes any further." A terrible misunderstanding. The phrase lodged in my mind with bitter precision. Nearly $4 million stolen over 7 years, documented through bank records and legal filings, was not a misunderstanding. It was theft, deliberate and sustained, and her characterization of it as anything less was simply another layer of manipulation designed to minimize accountability and shift blame. I deleted the voicemail without responding. My father called 30 minutes later, his approach more controlled but no less manipulative. His voicemail adopted the reasonable tone I recognize from his professional life, the voice he used when trying to appear calm and rational while actually working to control a situation. "Natalie, your mother is very upset, and I think we should all sit down together to discuss this situation like adults. I understand you are angry, but involving lawyers and courts is only going to make everything worse and cost everyone a great deal of money and emotional energy. Please call me so we can arrange a time to talk privately before this escalates further." The suggestion that we handle this privately was particularly galling. They had handled everything privately for 29 years, conducting their theft in secret while maintaining a facade of normalcy and parental concern. Privacy had served their interests perfectly, allowing them to operate without oversight or accountability. Now that their actions had been exposed and formal systems of justice had been engaged, they wanted to retreat back into privacy where they could continue to control the narrative and avoid consequences. I did not return his call either. Jennifer Park had advised me explicitly not to engage in any direct communication with my parents without legal counsel present, warning that anything I said could potentially be used against me in the proceedings, and that they would likely attempt to manipulate me into making statements or agreements that would undermine the legal case. I trusted her guidance and recognized that my parents were not calling to apologize or make amends, but rather to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. The calls continued throughout that day and into the evening. My mother called 6 more times, leaving increasingly emotional voicemails that progressed from requesting conversation to demanding it to finally berating me for my cruelty and ingratitude. In the final voicemail, her voice shook with what sounded like genuine rage as she said, "After everything we have done for you, after raising you and loving you and giving you every opportunity, this is how you repay us? By sicking lawyers on us and trying to destroy our lives? You are being manipulated by your grandfather, who has always resented me and wanted to turn you against us. I never thought my own daughter could be so vindictive and cruel." The message was so brazenly dishonest that I found myself laughing, a harsh sound in the quiet of my apartment. Everything they had done for me. The phrase was remarkable in its audacity. They had provided the basic legal requirements of housing and feeding a minor child, then systematically stolen millions of dollars designated for my future, while watching me struggle through young adulthood in poverty they had artificially created. This was not care or love or opportunity. This was exploitation dressed in the language of parental sacrifice. My father's subsequent calls maintained his controlled tone, but revealed increasing desperation beneath the surface. He spoke of family loyalty and the importance of working through difficulties together rather than bringing in outside parties. He referenced my childhood, reminding me of birthday parties and family vacations, as though pleasant memories from decades ago somehow balanced against recent theft of millions of dollars. He suggested that I was being influenced by my grandfather's vindictiveness rather than making my own decisions, attempting to undermine my agency and independence even while facing consequences for having exploited exactly those qualities. I blocked both their numbers after the 10th call, unable to bear the constant interruption and emotional manipulation even though I was not answering or listening to most of the voicemails. The silence that followed felt simultaneously relieving and ominous, a respite I knew could not last because they would find other ways to attempt contact and pressure. The next approach came through extended family members who apparently had been recruited to intercede on my parents' behalf. My Aunt Caroline, my mother's younger sister, called from California with a carefully prepared speech about the importance of family and forgiveness. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made, but urged me to consider the bigger picture of family relationships that span lifetimes and should not be destroyed over financial disagreements. Her framing of millions of dollars of theft as a mere financial disagreement was so absurd that I ended the call mid-sentence, unwilling to engage with someone who clearly had been fed a distorted version of events and was operating as my parents' proxy. My Uncle Thomas, my father's brother, sent a long email that attempted to appeal to my compassion and rationality. He described my parents' distress and fear, painted a picture of them as people who had made errors in judgment but did not deserve the severity of legal consequences I was pursuing. He suggested that family counseling and private mediation would be more appropriate responses than litigation, that airing private family matters in public court proceedings would harm everyone involved and accomplish nothing productive. The email concluded with a thinly veiled threat about how my actions were causing pain to elderly relatives, including my grandfather, suggesting that the stress of family conflict was dangerous to his health, and that I should consider whether pursuing this case was worth potentially contributing to serious medical consequences. The attempt to weaponize my grandfather's age and health was particularly offensive given that he was the one who had discovered the theft and insisted on pursuing accountability. I forwarded the email to Jennifer Park without responding to my uncle, adding a brief note asking whether this kind of pressure campaign was typical in cases like mine. Her response came within an hour, confirming that family members often attempted to intercede on behalf of perpetrators, and that I should document all such contact but not engage with it directly. On the 6th day after service of papers, my parents made their most direct and unavoidable attempt at forced interaction. They appeared at my apartment building in the early evening, parking their luxury sedan in the loading zone, and entering the building through the security door when another tenant was exiting. I learned of their presence only when they knocked on my apartment door. My mother's distinctive pattern of 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones that I recognized from childhood. I froze in place, standing in the middle of my studio apartment and staring at the door as though it might provide guidance about how to handle this invasion. Sarah was not there, having gone home after spending most of the previous evening with me. I was alone and unprepared for direct confrontation, particularly in my own living space where I should have been safe from intrusion. The knocking continued, growing more insistent, my mother's voice filtering through the thin door with artificial sweetness. "Natalie, sweetheart, we know you are in there. Please open the door. We just want to talk to you for a few minutes. We are your parents and we love you and we deserve at least a conversation before you destroy our lives with these legal actions." The words were spoken loudly enough that I knew my neighbors could hear, creating a performance of reasonable parents being rejected by an unreasonable daughter. I remained silent and motionless, hoping they would eventually leave but knowing from long experience that my mother's persistence rarely yielded to passive resistance. My father's voice joined hers, lower and more controlled but still audible through the door. "Natalie, we are not leaving until you talk to us. We can stand out here all evening if necessary. I am sure you do not want to involve your neighbors or building management in this family matter, so please just open the door and give us 10 minutes of your time. That is all we are asking." The implicit threat was clear. They would create a scene, would force my neighbors to witness family conflict, would potentially involve the building management in ways that could complicate my tenancy. The threat worked precisely because they understood my conflict-averse nature, my deep discomfort with public confrontation, my tendency to accommodate others to avoid creating difficulties. They were leveraging intimate knowledge of my personality and vulnerabilities to pressure me into engagement I had every right to refuse. I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer Park, grateful that she had provided her cell phone number for exactly this kind of emergency. She answered quickly, and I explained the situation in a whisper, describing my parents' presence outside my door and their refusal to leave. Her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Do not open the door. Do not engage with them at all. I am going to call the police and report that they are violating the restraining order by attempting to contact you. The order specifically prohibits any direct or indirect contact. Stay on the phone with me until the police arrive." The knowledge that law enforcement would be arriving shifted something in my emotional state from fear and uncertainty to a strange calm. My parents had chosen this confrontation, had decided to violate a court order to force interaction I had clearly declined. Whatever consequences followed were entirely of their own making, and I did not need to feel guilty for utilizing legal protections that existed precisely for situations like this. My mother's voice grew more strident as minutes passed without response. Natalie-chan, I am your mother and I am ordering you to open this door right now. This is ridiculous and childish and you are going to regret treating us this way. Your grandfather has poisoned your mind against us, but we are your family, and we deserve respect and consideration. Open this door immediately. The shift from pleading to demanding revealed the anger beneath the initial performance of reasonable parental concern, the barely controlled rage at my refusal to comply with their wishes. My father attempted to regain control of the narrative, his voice projecting calm authority as he said, Natalie, I understand you are upset, and you feel we made mistakes in managing the trust account. We are prepared to discuss restitution, and to work out a fair arrangement that addresses your concerns. But these legal actions are excessive and destructive. If you will just open the door and talk to us like an adult, we can resolve this situation tonight without involving courts and lawyers and creating a permanent rift in our family. The offer of restitution was clearly designed to sound reasonable, while actually conceding nothing. They were prepared to discuss restitution, not to actually provide it. They wanted to work out a fair arrangement, with fairness presumably defined by them rather than by objective standards or legal requirements. The entire framing positioned them as reasonable parties seeking compromise while characterizing my pursuit of legal remedies as excessive and destructive, inverting the reality that they were the ones who had committed destruction through years of systematic theft. Jennifer Park remained on the phone with me, her presence a steadying force as I listened to my parents' escalating attempts to provoke response. She provided a running commentary on the legal implications of their behavior, noting that every statement they made was potentially useful evidence of their attitude toward their obligations and their willingness to manipulate me. She had already dispatched police to my location and confirmed they were en route with an estimated arrival time of less than 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes stretched interminably, my parents' voices continuing their alternating pattern of pleading and demanding, sweet appeals to family loyalty followed by angry accusations of betrayal and ingratitude. My mother began crying at one point, loud sobs that sounded theatrical even through the door, her voice breaking as she spoke about how much pain I was causing her, and how she had devoted her entire life to being a good mother, only to be rewarded with cruelty and legal persecution. My father attempted to comfort her in a performance clearly intended for my benefit, his voice soft and soothing as he said he was sure I would come to my senses and recognize how badly I was behaving. The sound of approaching sirens penetrated even through the door and the noise of my parents' monologue. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by urgent whispered consultation between my mother and father. I heard my mother's voice, panicked now, saying something about leaving before the police arrived, that this was going to make everything worse. My father responded in tones too low for me to distinguish words, but I could hear the urgency and fear that had replaced his earlier controlled authority. Jennifer Park heard the sirens through my phone and confirmed that police were arriving. Stay inside until an officer knocks and identifies themselves, she instructed. Do not open the door for your parents under any circumstances. The officers will handle the situation from here. I acknowledged her instructions and waited, hearing footsteps in the hallway, doors opening, voices raised in explanation and protest. The knock that eventually came was professional and distinct from my parents' earlier attempts, accompanied by a clear identification. Seattle Police Department. We received a report of a restraining order violation at this address. I need to speak with Natalie-chan. I opened the door to find two officers in the hallway, their presence both reassuring and surreal. My parents stood several feet away, my mother's makeup streaked with tears and my father's usual composure badly fractured. One officer remained with me while the other spoke with my parents, taking statements and reviewing the restraining order documentation. I provided my account of events, explaining that they had appeared uninvited despite the court order prohibiting contact, that they had refused to leave when implicitly asked through my non-response, that they had remained outside my door for over 15 minutes attempting to force interaction. Jennifer Park spoke with the officers through my phone, confirming the legal status of the restraining order and its explicit prohibition of any contact. The officer speaking with my parents explained the situation with professional detachment. They were in violation of a court order, which was a criminal offense that could result in arrest and additional charges. They needed to leave the premises immediately and were prohibited from returning or attempting any further contact. Any future violations would result in arrest without additional warning. The officer's tone allowed no room for argument or negotiation, simply stating facts and consequences with the authority of law enforcement backing the court's orders. My mother attempted to explain that they were only trying to talk to their daughter, that this was a family matter being blown out of proportion, that surely the police had more important things to do than interfere with parents trying to communicate with their child. The officer cut her off with practiced efficiency, explaining that court orders existed precisely to prevent unwanted contact, and that the motivation behind the violation was irrelevant to its legal status. They had been ordered not to contact me. They had contacted me. They were therefore in violation and needed to leave immediately or face arrest. My father placed a hand on my mother's arm, silencing her protests, and nodded to the officers. "We are leaving now. This has been a misunderstanding, but we will comply with the order going forward." His voice had recovered some of its professional smoothness, attempting to salvage dignity from the situation even as the reality of police intervention demonstrated the complete failure of their confrontation strategy. They walked toward the elevator with the second officer following to ensure they actually left the building, my mother looking back over her shoulder with an expression I could not fully read from the distance, something that might have been genuine anguish or might have been continued performance. The officer who remained with me asked whether I felt safe in my apartment or needed any additional assistance. I assured him I was fine, that I had support from friends who could come over if needed, that I appreciated the prompt response. He provided me with a case number and explained that the violation would be documented and could be used in any subsequent legal proceedings. He also suggested I consider documenting all attempted contact from my parents or their representatives, as establishing a pattern of violating boundaries could be useful if further legal action became necessary. After the officers departed, I closed and locked my door, then stood in the middle of my studio apartment feeling the adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation begin to dissipate. My hands were shaking, my breathing rapid and shallow, my entire body responding to the stress of the encounter now that immediate crisis had passed. I called Sarah, needing to hear a friendly voice, needing to ground myself in the reality that I had people who supported me, and that I had not been wrong to refuse engagement with my parents. She answered immediately, and I recounted the entire encounter while she listened with occasional expressions of outrage on my behalf. When I finished, she said with fierce certainty, "You did exactly the right thing. They were trying to manipulate and intimidate you, and you held your boundaries. That took real strength, Natalie. I am proud of you." Her words settled over me like a protective layer, insulation against the doubt and guilt that threatened to creep in now that the immediate situation had resolved. We talked for over an hour, Sarah offering to come over but accepting my assurance that I would be fine alone for the evening. After we ended the call, I found myself replaying the encounter in my mind, examining it from different angles and considering what it revealed about my parents and about myself. They had been willing to violate a court order, to risk arrest and additional legal consequences, to create a public scene involving neighbors and police, all in an attempt to force me into conversation that might allow them to manipulate me into backing down from legal action. The desperation was revealing. If they truly believed their actions had been innocent or justifiable, they would have been willing to present their case through proper legal channels. Instead, they were attempting to circumvent those channels through direct pressure, suggesting they knew their legal position was weak, and their only hope was convincing me to abandon pursuit of accountability. Their willingness to lie to extended family members, to recruit others into pressuring me, to appear at my home in violation of court orders, demonstrated that they were willing to use any means available to avoid consequences. I thought about the version of myself that had existed before the revelation at the birthday dinner, the woman who would likely have opened the door when her parents knocked, who would have listened to their explanations and justifications, who would have wanted to believe they had good intentions despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. That version of myself had been shaped by 29 years of conditioning to prioritize their needs and comfort, to minimize my own hurt and anger, to believe that good daughters accommodated their parents regardless of personal cost. But I was no longer that woman, or at least I was becoming someone different. The revelation of their theft and the evidence of their continued manipulation had broken something fundamental in the dynamic between us, had shattered my willingness to accept their framing of reality over my own observations and experiences. I had refused to open the door. I had maintained boundaries despite pressure and guilt. I had utilized legal protections rather than trying to handle everything privately in ways that would have privileged their interests over my own safety and well-being. These were small victories in some sense, simple acts of self-protection that should not have required courage but which felt revolutionary given my history and conditioning. I had said no to my parents, had refused their demands, had prioritized my own needs and safety over their desire for control and access. The act of refusal, maintained despite their physical presence and emotional manipulation, represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my relationship to them and to my own authority over my life. The following morning, Jennifer Park called to debrief about the incident and discuss its implications for the upcoming hearing. The police report documenting the restraining order violation would be submitted to the court as evidence of my parents' willingness to flout legal boundaries and their continued attempts to manipulate and control me. The judge would consider this behavior when evaluating both the temporary restraining order and the underlying claims of financial exploitation and breach of fiduciary duty. Jennifer Park also mentioned that my parents' attorney had reached out requesting a settlement conference, suggesting that the previous evening's events had made them recognize that avoiding legal proceedings entirely was no longer possible. They were apparently now willing to engage in negotiation, though the terms they proposed were entirely inadequate and clearly designed to minimize their losses rather than provide appropriate restitution. Jennifer Park had declined the proposed terms and indicated that we would present our case at the scheduled hearing. The hearing was now 4 days away, and I would be required to attend and potentially testify about the trust fund, my parents' management of it, and the impact their theft had on my life. Jennifer Park would prepare me for testimony, help me understand what questions to expect, and how to present information clearly and credibly. The prospect of testifying filled me with anxiety, but also with a strange sense of purpose. I would finally have the opportunity to speak truth in a setting where my parents could not interrupt or reframe or dismiss what I said, where evidence and documentation would support my account and undermine their denials. I spent the days leading up to the hearing in a state of focused preparation, meeting multiple times with Jennifer Park to review documents and practice testimony, working with Sarah to manage the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me in unguarded moments. I selected clothing for the hearing with the same care I had applied to my initial meeting with Jennifer Park, understanding that appearance and demeanor would be evaluated along with the substance of my testimony. I needed to appear credible and sympathetic, a wronged daughter seeking justice rather than a vindictive child punishing her parents. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep despite exhaustion, my mind running through possible scenarios and outcomes, imagining my parents' faces as evidence was presented, wondering whether the judge would see through their manipulations or be swayed by their performances of parental concern and financial difficulty. I got out of bed around 3 in the morning and sat by the window of my studio apartment, looking out at the sleeping city and considering how much had changed in the span of 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, I had believed myself to be exactly what my parents had told me I was. A struggling young woman who needed to work harder and manage money better, whose difficulties were the result of her own choices and limitations. Now I knew I was someone whose future had been stolen by the people who should have protected it, whose struggles had been artificially created through systematic theft, whose entire adult life had been constructed on a foundation of lies. The knowledge was both devastating and liberating, destroying my previous self-understanding, while creating space for something new to emerge. Whatever happened at the hearing, whatever the judge decided about the restraining order and the underlying claims, I knew I could not return to the person I had been before. That version of myself had been built to accommodate my parents' exploitation, to make excuses for their behavior, to accept treatment that no one should accept from people who claim to love them. The woman I was becoming understood that love did not look like theft, that family obligations did not include tolerating abuse, that forgiveness without accountability was simply permission for continued harm. As morning light began filtering through my window, I prepared for the day ahead with a sense of grim determination. I would walk into that courtroom, would tell my story under oath, would present evidence that spoke louder than any performance of parental concern my mother and father might attempt. I would face them not as the accommodating daughter they had raised me to be, but as an adult woman demanding accountability for years of exploitation and theft. The outcome remained uncertain, but my commitment to pursuing justice had become absolute. They had stolen my past and attempted to steal my future. I would not allow them to steal my voice as well. The King County Courthouse occupied an imposing modernist structure in downtown Seattle, all concrete and glass rising against the morning sky with the kind of architectural severity that seemed designed to remind visitors of the weight and authority of legal proceedings. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing, accompanied by my grandfather and Jennifer Park, the three of us moving through security checkpoints and elevator banks with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The hallway outside the courtroom was sterile and fluorescent lit, lined with wooden benches where various parties waited for their cases to be called. My parents were already present when we arrived, seated on a bench at the opposite end of the corridor with their attorney, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s whose expensive suit and measured demeanor communicated decades of courtroom experience. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, dressed in a conservative navy suit that seemed calculated to project respectability and maternal dignity. My father sat beside her with his characteristic posture of controlled composure, though I noticed the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw muscles flexed periodically as he stared at some point on the wall opposite. They looked up as we approached, and for a moment our eyes met across the distance of the hallway. My mother's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession, something that might have been hope or pleading quickly replaced by hurt, and then by a hardening that suggested anger barely contained beneath the surface. My father's face remained more controlled, but I saw recognition and calculation in his gaze, the lawyer's instinct to assess and strategize even in circumstances where he was the defendant rather than the advocate. Jennifer Park guided me to a bench on our side of the hallway, positioning herself between me and my parents in a configuration that felt both protective and strategic. My grandfather sat on my other side, his presence solid and grounding, one hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture of support before he settled into the quiet dignity that characterized his public demeanor. We waited in tense silence, the only sounds the muted conversations of other parties waiting for their hearings, and the periodic announcements from courtroom staff calling cases. My parents' attorney approached after several minutes, introducing himself as Richard Holloway, and requesting a brief conversation with Jennifer Park. They stepped several feet away, speaking in voices too low for me to distinguish words, though I watched Jennifer Park's body language remain firmly professional and unreceptive to whatever proposals or arguments were being advanced. The conversation concluded within minutes, and she returned to our bench with an expression that conveyed both frustration and something that might have been grim satisfaction. "They are offering a settlement," she said quietly, angling her body so that only my grandfather and I could hear. $2 million paid over 5 years in exchange for dismissal of all claims, and a confidentiality agreement prohibiting you from discussing the case or their conduct. They want an answer before we go into the hearing. The offer was clearly designed to appear generous, while actually providing far less than full restitution, and protecting my parents from public accountability through the confidentiality requirement. My grandfather made a sound of disgust low in his throat. $2 million paid over 5 years, when they stole nearly $4 million and have assets worth considerably more than that. They are offering to return barely half of what they took, spread over a timeline that allows them to continue benefiting from the appreciation of assets purchased with stolen money. His analysis was precise and damning, cutting through any pretense that the offer represented genuine restitution rather than strategic damage control. Jennifer Park nodded her agreement. "It is an insulting offer given the circumstances and the evidence, but I am obligated to present it to you and let you make the decision. If you accept, this ends today with a settlement agreement. If you decline, we proceed with the hearing and the full litigation process with all its uncertainties and delays." She looked at me directly, her expression making clear that she expected me to refuse but needed to ensure I understood the choice being offered. I thought about $2 million, an amount that would have seemed incomprehensible wealth just weeks ago when I was worrying about rent and student loan payments. $2 million would solve every immediate financial problem, would provide security and opportunity beyond anything I had imagined possible during the years of artificial scarcity my parents had imposed. But accepting it would mean agreeing that their theft was worth only partial consequences, That stealing nearly $4 million and watching me struggle for years resulted in merely returning half of what was taken with no admission of wrongdoing and no public accountability. No, I said, the word emerging with certainty that surprised even me. I am not accepting that offer. They took everything from me and watched me suffer. I want full restitution and I want the truth to be part of the public record. I am not going to sign a confidentiality agreement that protects them from the natural consequences of their actions. My grandfather squeezed my shoulder again briefly, his gesture conveying approval and support. Jennifer Park nodded once, satisfaction flickering across her professional expression before she returned to inform Richard Holloway that his settlement offer had been declined. I watched my parents' reaction from across the hallway as their attorney conveyed my refusal. My mother's face crumpled, tears beginning to flow in a display of distress that might have been genuine emotional response, or might have been calculated performance. My father's jaw tightened further, his hands curling into fists on his knees before he deliberately relaxed them and leaned close to speak to my mother in tones too low to carry. Whatever he said seemed to have some stabilizing effect, her tears subsiding into quiet misery while she extracted a tissue from her purse and dabbed carefully at her eyes in a manner that preserved her makeup. The courtroom doors opened and a bailiff emerged, calling our case number and instructing all parties to enter. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had expected from television depictions, a functional space with seating for perhaps 50 people in the gallery, a raised bench where the judge would preside, tables for the opposing parties, and a witness stand positioned to the judge's left. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table, Jennifer Park in the center with me on her right and my grandfather on her left. My parents and their attorney occupied the defendant's table across the aisle, close enough that I could hear my mother's ragged breathing and smell the perfume she had worn for as long as I could remember. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise as Judge Patricia Morrison entered through a door behind the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair, and an expression that conveyed both intelligence and impatience with anything that wasted her time. She took her seat and gestured for everyone else to sit, then opened the file before her and spent several moments reviewing documents while the courtroom waited in silence. When she finally looked up, her gaze swept across both tables with the assessing quality of someone accustomed to evaluating credibility and cutting through obfuscation. This is a hearing on the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction and other emergency relief in the matter of Chan v. Chen, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. I have reviewed the motion, the supporting declarations and evidence, and the response filed by defendants. I have also reviewed the police report from Thursday evening documenting defendants' apparent violation of the temporary restraining order currently in place. Before we proceed with testimony, I want to hear brief opening statements from counsel outlining what you believe the evidence will show. Jennifer Park stood, smoothing her suit jacket in a gesture that seemed more ritual than necessary, and approached the lectern positioned between the two tables. Your Honor, the evidence will show that defendants Catherine and David Chan served as trustees of an irrevocable trust, established for their daughter Natalie by her maternal grandfather Robert Zhang. The trust contained over $4 million designated specifically for Natalie's benefit and education. Rather than managing these funds in Natalie's best interest as their fiduciary duty required, defendants systematically misappropriated nearly the entire trust over a 7-year period, spending these funds on luxury purchases including a residential property, vehicles, jewelry, travel, and investments in Catherine Chen's failing business. She paused, letting the summary settle before continuing. During this same period, Natalie struggled with student loan debt, inadequate housing, and financial insecurity because defendants actively concealed the existence of the trust from her. When confronted with evidence of their theft, defendants did not express remorse or offer restitution. Instead, they purchased one-way airline tickets to Costa Rica and began transferring assets in preparation for fleeing the jurisdiction. They have continued attempting to manipulate and pressure Natalie, even after being served with a restraining order, as evidenced by their appearance at her apartment in violation of that order just days ago. The evidence will demonstrate that defendants are both untrustworthy with assets and likely to continue hiding or dissipating those assets if not immediately enjoined by this court. Richard Holloway rose as Jennifer Park returned to our table, his movements deliberate and practiced. He positioned himself at the lectern with the confidence of someone who had occupied this space countless times before. Your Honor, defendants do not dispute that they made withdrawals from the trust account. However, the characterization of these withdrawals as theft fundamentally misrepresents the circumstances and the parties' relationship. Catherine and David Chun are loving parents who made financial decisions they believed were in their family's collective best interest during a period of significant economic pressure. I felt my hands clench involuntarily at the characterization, forcing myself to remain still and expressionless despite the rage building in my chest. Richard Holloway continued, his tone reasonable and sympathetic. The family experienced severe financial difficulties following the 2008 economic crisis. David Chin's law firm cut partner distributions significantly. Catherine Chin's interior design business struggled as clients canceled projects and delayed payments. They faced the real possibility of losing their home and being unable to maintain basic stability. In these circumstances, they made the difficult decision to temporarily borrow from the trust with every intention of replacing those funds before Natalie needed them. The narrative was carefully constructed to reframe theft as borrowing, to position my parents as victims of economic circumstances rather than perpetrators of calculated exploitation, to suggest that their actions were temporary and well-intentioned rather than sustained and self-serving. Richard Holloway gestured toward my parents, inviting the judge to see them as sympathetic figures. They have been devastated by their daughter's rejection and by these legal proceedings. They love Natalie deeply and want nothing more than to repair their relationship and make amends for mistakes made during a period of financial desperation. The extreme relief sought by plaintiff, including total asset freeze and prohibitions on travel, is unnecessary and punitive given that defendants are willing to work cooperatively toward resolution. Judge Morrison's expression had not changed throughout either opening statement, maintaining the same neutral assessment that revealed nothing of her preliminary conclusions. Thank you, counsel. Ms. Park, call your first witness. Jennifer Park stood again, her posture conveying quiet confidence. The plaintiff calls Natalie Chun to testify, Your Honor. I rose from my seat with legs that felt unsteady, hyper-aware of my parents' presence as I walked past their table toward the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath, and I promised to tell the truth with a voice that emerged stronger than I had expected given the anxiety churning in my stomach. I took my seat in the witness box, adjusting the microphone to the appropriate height while Jennifer Park positioned herself at the lectern with her notes. The direct examination began with basic background questions establishing my identity, age, and relationship to the parties. Jennifer Park's questions were clear and methodical, designed to elicit information in a logical sequence that would build toward the more emotionally difficult testimony about discovering the trust and understanding the scope of my parents' theft. She asked about my education, and I explained my undergraduate and graduate degrees, the student loans I had taken to fund them, the part-time work throughout those years. Did your parents ever discuss your educational funding with you? Jennifer Park asked. I nodded, then remembered to verbalize my response for the court record. Yes. When I was applying to colleges, they told me they could contribute some amount toward tuition but that I needed to take primary responsibility for my education costs. They emphasized the importance of financial independence and learning to manage debt responsibly. They made similar statements when I was applying to graduate school, explaining that they could not help fund advanced degrees because they needed to protect their retirement savings. Jennifer Park allowed a pause for that statement to register before asking her next question. At any point during your educational years or afterward, did your parents mention the existence of a trust fund established for your benefit? I shook my head. Never. I had no knowledge of any trust fund until my grandfather asked me about it at my birthday dinner 2 weeks ago. I believed I was funding my own education through loans and work because that was what my parents told me was necessary. The questioning continued through my post-graduation years, establishing the timeline of my employment, my housing circumstances, my financial struggles. Jennifer Park had me describe the studio apartment where I currently lived, the inadequate heating and water stains and thin walls, the reality of spending nearly half my income on rent for 700 square feet in a marginal neighborhood. She asked about times I had sought help from my parents, and I recounted the conversation when I lost my previous job and my mother had suggested budgeting apps rather than offering financial assistance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.